Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of War Diplomacy. I'm here with my colleagues, Christian and Aramis. And of course, this would be
Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus.
a favorite episode.
Okay. Well,
Christian, that is true. But can you please remind us who's Dr. Tedros? I think everyone knows, but just to remind our listeners, who's that guy?
that is the Secretary General of the World Health Organization.
And really relevant for this topic, as the listeners might have read. The title is the New Global Health Order, and we're going to address a lot of issues regarding the pandemic, regarding global health, and what's the situation lately. But well, before we dig into the topic, how are you, man? How are you, Aramis? You're also here with us.
Yeah, I'm fine, thanks. I recently had COVID, but luckily that's over and doing good. Thank you.
All right. Let me introduce this episode's guest, my dear friend Josephine Mosset. How are you, Josephine?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
No, it's her pleasure. It's her pleasure. Well, Josephine is not just one of my closest friends here in Brussels. She's also an incredible professional. She's a specialist in global health policy. She currently works as a program manager. She's in charge of health and digital work streams at the Africa Europe Foundation, where she currently focuses on initiatives regarding health workforces. She did her master's degree in public policy with a focus on global health in Sciences Po in Paris. And she has a lot of experience in various health-based organizations such as EuroArtis. I don't know if
You're
I
artist. Yeah.
EuroArtis, Sanofi, Next Step Health. She's a dual national of France and Ireland, and she speaks French, English, and she says that she speaks immediate Spanish, but I think she speaks really well Spanish. So it's a
That's what you
pleasure.
say. That's what you say.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Josephine. And guys, I just thought that it was a really interesting idea to start talking about the pandemic and COVID. If we maybe share with our listeners, if we did got COVID, how did that happen? I don't know. Aramis, you told me that you just got it. So how did it happen? Was it strong for you? How was your experience?
For so many months, I thought, okay, I'm immune to COVID because I was exposed so many times to other people who had COVID and I didn't catch it. But yeah, then I got it, and yeah, it was okay. I mean, just the usual symptoms. But what I was really worried about is long COVID because the Omicron variant, you don't know yet what the long term effects will be, and like a fatigue that continues for months or years, it would be horrible, of course. Yeah, so far it seems like it's I'm doing quite fine.
What about you, Chris? Did you get COVID in the past years?
Yeah, it was very similar to what Aramis just said. It's not too long since I had it as well. It was middle of January this year, and yeah, well, I had the exact same experience being exposed throughout the last years a lot of times and not catching it, thinking I was immune. I even experienced having my girlfriend, who I live with back in Oslo, having she got COVID twice, and one of those times we were living together like normal, and I never caught it. Unfortunately, then I got it coming back to Brussels after Christmas break. Yeah, it was quite harsh. I was also a bit worried about the long COVID, but thus far it seems I'm just as fatigued as I normally am, so it hasn't changed much.
And what about you, Josephine? Did you get COVID? Can you please share your
I think
experience?
I think mine might be the more interesting experience. It was just was it what beginning of January? We were thinking, okay, we want to organize drinks, but we'll be reasonable and responsible. So we decided to ask everyone to do a self test before joining the party. So I'm sat around a table. I think Fabio's at that table actually, and we're just sipping beers, having a good time and doing our tests. And one stage, I see my housemate Arthur just like looking towards like the table and then looking at me all of a sudden and like with wide eyes, and I'm like, what's wrong? And he's like, your test is positive. And I'm like, there's no way. I'm like, fine. And literally I look down and it's positive. So one of my housemates, Tom, rushes to his room and gets me to like do another test. Everyone gathers and I'm immediately like positive. So I was just banned to my bedroom for a week.
To your room,
Like honestly,
Josephine.
I would never have known. Like had we not like decided to be reasonable and actually test before a party. So I think it
Yeah.
was kind of an interesting experience. We have it recorded on camera, my reaction to like being banned. So
It was hilarious. We had to text everyone in the party, guys. Someone just tested positive. If you want to come, I mean, up to you. Long story short, and please, listeners, don't spread this information. We did end up having that party.
No.
It was really fun.
Yeah, I could hear it from my window.
Yeah.
That's a bit
Well,
sad.
it was interesting. In my case, I don't know if I got COVID or not, guys. To be honest, I was in this house when everyone got it, and I feel like
Yes,
maybe I did,
I think you
but
did.
no symptoms whatsoever. So who knows? Who knows? Maybe I did. Well, guys, now that we have shared a little bit of our experiences, why don't we dig into the topic? And I think that global health governance is such an interesting topic now that the pandemic happened. It's the first, well, it's not the first pandemic, but it's, I don't know, like globalization and then social media and the spread of information in these past years made it really, felt really close to us. So I don't think that there's anyone in this planet that the pandemic didn't affect in one way or another. So maybe just, Josephine, why don't you explain us a little bit? What is global health?
So I think, before even jumping into global health, I think, the thing about health is that it's insanely political. And I think it's this one thing that, everyone has health. Everyone's affected by health issues. Everyone knows someone that has a disease or like a health problem. So I think it's, the thing about health is it's so personal, but it's so, political at the same time that I think it's incredible topic because, you cannot say, oh, I don't care about health, because health is the beginning and the end of everything. And without health, you don't have a sound economy. You don't have, financial systems. You don't, because health is what governs us. So I think that's one thing that I'm passionate about. It's like how essential health is. Global health for a very long time did not, for the longest time actually, did not benefit from the level of interest that it should. We saw the creation of institutions like the World Health Organization, in the mid 50s, when there was all these these institutions being set up with the UN, etc. And for the longest time, they really had this role of like supporting the global South, but there really wasn't much of a focus at all on for example, North America, Europe, because they had their own systems, like especially Europe with welfare systems and universal health coverage. But I think, there's been a bigger focus on global health. It started with the HIV pandemic. That was, I think that was such an important turning point in history where all of a sudden you had to have some kind of an international approach to health, because this was something that was affecting everyone across the world. And I think, since then there was a bunch of outbreaks, but I think COVID, as you say, has really put health on the top of political agendas for the last 2 years. Health used to be really something that was in the remit of ministers for health. And let's say that within governments, it was very much considered as a very expensive ministry, something that, we would want to cut on. And I think, now with the pandemic and how much has affected everyone, heads of state has gone up to heads of state level saying, health is crucial. And I think that finally we're starting to see proper investments. And I think a part of it is the recognition that health should not just be in the remit of a national government. It should be more of a wider level. And I know we're going to talk about it more during this podcast, but there's kind of a discrepancy between how the speeches of saying we need to have global cooperation and how things were dealt with in practice, and how we need global is yet something that's very much spoken of, but in terms of proper action, there's a lot to be done. But this concept is really, it's the idea that health is not just something that it doesn't respect human borders. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
It doesn't respect diplomatic borders. So dealing with health as a country is very limited, obviously, because a pandemic is just going to cross the border in a day, and what are you going to do if you're just acting yourself as an individual country? You're only going to go so far. So I think that's really, and pandemics obviously put this in perspective.
And even if you close the border, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic when it came to Europe in Italy and they closed the border, and it was like, it's not going to make a difference.
No.
Maybe it can slow down a little bit, but it's going to go global. It's going to spread everywhere because now people move around. There's trade. Even North Korea had a lot of COVID cases, which we don't really know because they have no data, but they did get it as well. So, but it's interesting. It's an interesting disease because Aramis and I were talking about Ebola in the early some years ago and how it did not become that. It didn't spread as much as COVID, maybe because of the essence of the disease. I don't know, Aramis, if you want to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so I read in my research for the episode a little about Ebola, and what was so special about this illness, or what I found to be interesting, was that the mortality rate of Ebola is much higher than compared to COVID. When you catch Ebola, I mean, correct me, Josephine, if I'm wrong, but apparently the mortality rate is 90%. So if you catch it, you're nearly dead. And also the way you die is very painful.
No, absolutely. However, one thing about Ebola is that it's not, see, basically the difference between Ebola and COVID, for instance, is how it spreads. I mean, Ebola, it's bodily fluids, so, so it's very much linked to like local practices for funerals, for example, where, in a lot of like countries, like in Africa, in West Africa, for instance, when the deceased, you clean the deceased, you exchange fluids, and that's how it spread. Obviously, this is not a very ideal way for a pandemic to explode worldwide. And the difference, for instance, with COVID is that it's in microparticles, so it's like airborne. It's you're in a room with someone, and it's gonna travel from you to that person, even though you're like have no physical contact. And I think that's obviously every disease it's spread in a different way, but I think that's the thing about COVID. It was just so contagious,
And the fact that you can be completely asymptomatic and still
Yes,
spread
of
it, I think
course.
that's what made it this
Of course.
super spreader. Because you could have it like me, maybe I did have it, and I just had no idea.
Hmm.
Like unless you do a test, you would be a potential spreader, and you didn't even know. So yeah, I think that made this specific disease so easy to spread everywhere.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're lucky that the mortality rate is so small, right? Like imagine that it would be a little bit higher. How many people would be dead?
I mean, you say small, but I think we need to one thing about pandemics, and I think about, even just crisis, because like the like as population, we have to learn to deal with it. We have to normalize it in a way. And I think you're just even what you just said is so interesting, because you say, thank God we didn't have so many people dying. There's 1 million people that died in the US. 1 million. Like just that's the population of Brussels. That is insane. I mean, that's talk about a mortality rate, it's wild. But somehow, because it's older people, because it's been spread out over 2 years, because we've had to deal with this for such a long time, where we're coming to a stage where we're like, you know what, it's fine. Like it's not so dangerous. I want my life to go back to normal. And I think it's because we have what we call COVID fatigue, right? Obviously, because we've all been so affected in our lives by this crisis. And yet again, making a point again to what I was saying at the beginning of the call about health affecting us so, intimately. You talk about wars going on in other parts of the world, and they will affect you, but up to a certain extent, right? A pandemic is like entirely shifting your life, and I mean it's got such intimate consequences in how your life is going to pan out. And I think that's yet again, like, how it's so political, but it's so personal at the same time.
And Chris, how do you feel about that? Because I think that now we're starting to feel that like post-pandemic, at least here in Western Europe, with the war in Ukraine, the pandemic went to the back of the agenda. No one really cares anymore. And regarding mask mandates, they're falling everywhere in West Europe. So I kind of feel like at least we have this feeling that the pandemic is over here. My family in Mexico tell me kind of similar things, but it's not the case in other places around the world.
I think it's important to acknowledge that there are very vast amounts of people who are still living under restrictions and also in a fear of the effects of this pandemic. Still, I can remember the last couple of weeks have seen cities of millions in China in full on lockdown because of Omicron. And just this week, I think there has been a report of 1.5 million cases in Germany still, which has lifted most of its restrictions, similarly to here in Belgium and most of Europe. Saying that we're already in the post-pandemic is kind of not necessarily the reality, but of course it's the dream for a lot of us. But I think also Josephine will get into this, but the reality of a lot of people that have been neglected in the distribution of vaccines will, if that doesn't speed up soon, we are going to live with this for a long time. Even though we lift restrictions here in Europe, we vaccinate all of our people, it's not going to work if not the whole world has access to the same health facilities as we do here.
Josephine, are there any or what are the latest predictions within the science community on how long we will have to deal with this pandemic? How long will it dominate our lives, in not just in the West but globally?
I mean, honestly, you know, you can only go so far with foresight, especially at this, like, you know, some like a pandemic like this. But I think, you know, to build on your points, you know, and this would might be, we might go into this later, but you know, there's a massive issue of equity. I mean, as you say, we in Western Europe and, you know, in the global North, let's say, we're walking away from this. And you know, first of all, that is, I mean, you know, like public health specialists and epidemiologists are actually raising their alarms right now. They're saying we're going too fast in like putting those restrictions down. I mean, the numbers are there. They're going higher and higher. People are getting sick, and you know, they're getting sick over and over again because these variants keep coming. And I think, you know, first of all, the pandemic is absolutely not over anywhere. But then, as you know, you were mentioning, I think it was Chris, China. I mean, that is zero COVID policy, and right now they're just in the midst of yet another outbreak. But going back to the global South, you know, I think that they are very much in the middle of this crisis, if not potentially in the beginning. And you know, because the weapons we have to deal with this pandemic have been the vaccines, right? And there was this call for global solidarity back in 2020 that was led, I mean, actually by the French Emmanuel Macron, but also just more globally, where we set up this facility called the COVAX facility, right? And the idea was great. It was, you know, let's share all of our supplies. Let's do this commonly. But then all of a sudden, as soon as, you know, the pharma industry was like creating those vaccines, countries are throwing themselves and buying up stock, you know, and all of a sudden there was so few doses that were available for everyone. So first of all, there was this inequity, and you know, this has widespread consequences, because if you only have half the population that's like, you know, vaccinated and half is not, I don't know, half, I'm being very kind here, you're actually you're creating a massive issue, because you're going to be creating the ground for variants, you know. And the thing about vaccines is that they can only go so far with variants. So basically, the lack of cooperation, the lack of global collaboration is having like deadly consequences within countries. However, and this is the issue with politics, I mean, a politician, what's their, you know, their first responsibility? It's towards the population that elected them. What does the population that elected them want? They want vaccine coverage, right? So you're a politician in Germany, you're a politician in Spain. What are you doing? You are, you know, making sure that you have those vaccine doses for your people. But that's not taking into account that, you know, some of the non-priority populations in Spain are getting this vaccine. The high priority people in, like, let's say Sierra Leone or Malawi are not. And this is fomenting the issue, is that how do you reconcile global and national? And I think, you know, I remember I organized this debate a month ago, and we were talking with the Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen, and we were challenging her on this. We're saying, you know, like, Europe is hauling those vaccines. And she said, yes, but you gotta understand as well that we have a responsibility to our people. And I think that was such an interesting point, was saying, you know, to what extent? How do you reconcile, you know, making sure that your people are covered and you're taken care of, with a global responsibility for action? I think that this, you know, this going back, because obviously we can go everywhere with this debate, or this discussion, but I think it's just showing how political this is.
No, it
this
is.
is, you know?
And what you said makes a lot of sense. Like, to actually end the pandemic, you need to vaccinate as many people as possible around the world. But with vaccine nationalization, it really complicates the issue. And I remember at the beginning of the vaccine distribution that the global North had like I don't remember, like maybe 60-70% of vaccinated people, and in the rest of the world it was nothing. It was like maybe 10%, and that's why Omicron
current
started.
Numbers, Fabio.
It's still current numbers.
Africa, 15% coverage. 15.
Damn.
Europe, 72. I mean, you know, the numbers speak for themselves.
They do. So do you guys think that COVAX and all these initiatives to promote vaccination in the global South have not lived to the expectations?
Well, I think there were never major expectations that it would be really successful in the short term. It was always concretely put that Africa will have a lack of vaccines and that they will have a problem. just concerning what Josephine said, I think one way to argue, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the lack of distribution by the Europeans could be saying that at the moment, at least it appears to me that Europe is the place where the COVID is spreading the most in the world. Like if we look at the past 2 years, and if you take that into account, it's also the place where we have the most, where it's the most likely that new variants will appear. So I think in that sense, you could argue, okay, um, this is a highly dangerous region. So with vaccines, it can be avoided that new variants are created, and therefore there needs to be special attention put to Europe, especially if you consider that, and maybe that might be because of lack of media coverage as well. But it seems to me that the global south has not been hit as severe as the global north.
Actually, Aramis, I think that's a really interesting point you're making. That's why we think. Why? Because we have the data. Honestly, and this is another essential point. See, what the global south is also dealing with is there's who's capturing the data? Who actually knows the numbers? Because like it's as simple as when you don't have sound data, how are you supposed to build policy? And it goes down to, for example, going back to like DRC, or let's say potentially Niger, like they don't have people on the ground collecting this data. So we think we have this false sense that it's not spreading, but it very much is. I think, Europe, where is Europe leading? Europe is leading in data collection. It's actually, you look at Denmark. Denmark is like a global leader in this, and they're actually setting up, best practices. And this is where you will get this false sense that there's like especially a spread in Europe. I think the spread does not respect any region. I think obviously where there's a lot of like interconnection of humans, obviously there's going to be more spreads. But I think that we're all affected the same way, but there very much is this sense because of the data that we see on our tables. And I think, I don't want to like change the topic, but I would just say very quickly, going forward, like obviously one lesson we have is that we need to build data collection systems to guide policy making, to guide decision making in health, because that's where you can find yourself in very dangerous situations where you have this false sense that you don't have a crisis just because you don't actually have the data from the ground.
And sometimes you can't even trust the numbers. I feel like with the amount of cases that were never reported, or some governments talking about Latin America, that they cleaned up the numbers a little bit, so things don't seem that bad, and they can continue opening the economy. And I think that's a really interesting topic that maybe, I don't know, Chris, if you have something to add, like that dilemma regarding opening economies or closing them because of the level of spread. It's always been a dilemma regarding policy making. So how do you see that, Chris?
I think that first, regarding, I want to touch upon this topic of data collection and also the advancements in health technologies, which creates this other dilemma, such as what we saw with the Omicron variant when South African scientists discovered the variant, and this turned into a full-on ban on South African flights. Almost the whole continent of Africa was punished for having discovered and done all of this amazing research to actually prepare us all for a new variant. And there we can touch upon a lot of other topics regarding unequal distribution of a lot of health technology, facility, all of this, but also what comes as a consequence for the countries, and then how this impacts these economies. South Africa was almost on the path towards being able to open up, having more tourism, which they are very heavily reliant on. A lot of countries around the world are very reliant on tourism, and we saw this both in the African continent, also Asia, which during the time that Omicron was discovered in late last fall, which was going to be their season for tourism from most of the global north and the west. and then having to shut down again, and having this being a punishment for having done the right thing, reporting, discovering, and making us all prepared. And I think that's, maybe Josephine, you can touch on more upon that, and how you see this in the more general discussion about, inequity in health policy and global health in general.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for giving this example. I think it's an absolutely, it's such a crucial, case, case in point about how basically South Africa was doing the right thing. South Africa was actually playing into the whole global solidarity agenda, and they were punished. They were literally punished for being transparent. And there's so much, I think, this touches upon also, there's so much resentment because how do we react in Europe and North America? We close our borders to these people who are actually, trying to help us and actually being open about the fact that there's a new variant. I think it was so revealing as to, like, we talk about global solidarity. We have all these big speeches. We have these big summits. We say we're going to put so much money, but in practice, when we go down to the actual reality on the ground, this is how we react. I mean, like, we've been talking about global health for decades at this stage, and we're still here. At the end of the day, we're still here. And we started this pandemic saying we're going to share vaccines, we're going to help one another. And the reality is we close our borders to Africans. We do not distribute evenly the vaccines. We do not support in horizontal investments towards health system strengthening. We reallocate money from one crisis to another as soon as there's something else that goes high up on the agenda. I mean, I think it's there's definitely, I think we are not there when it comes to solidarity, unfortunately. I think, however, and I don't want to be so pessimistic, I think there's also a lot of good that came out of it. And for instance, going back to the whole COVAX facility, was it a success? No. Was it a failure? It wasn't either.
But
Actually,
better than
no.
nothing.
You know what?
No?
Because this was arguably the largest logistical operation that was ever set up by humanity.
Worldwide.
Think about it.
Worldwide, yeah.
I mean, we're talking about a global vaccination campaign. We're talking about vaccinating billions of people.
And the vaccine got produced in a year. That's
exactly
incredible.
It's insane. And I think that we also need to recognize that it's not all bleak. Actually, we've been reaching people. We've been getting doses to people, and I think that I think it's just a really good lesson as to how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
And Josephine, you that you work in this sector, you talk to these professionals that are in the field. What can be better? How can this distribution be implemented or improved?
Yeah, actually, a really good point. I was actually talking to the director of health programs at UNICEF actually a month ago, and he was saying basically, so we got those vaccines, we secured them, but how do we get a vaccine from, being in a manufacturing site in Belgium into the arms of someone that lives, for instance, in Botswana, I mean, or let's say, I don't know, Syria or another country. And this is very much part of this logistical operation, how to which extent global cooperation goes, because this is a highly complex product. We have to have cold chain, we have to have storage, we have to have trained professionals, we have to reach the last mile. And I think that's where we currently stand with this vaccination campaign. The positive is we have enough doses. Africa officially has enough doses.
They just can't get them to
but
the
now
people.
it's how do you reach your people, and it's about infrastructure, electricity, because these are vaccines that you need to keep in fridges, but if you don't have electricity, you don't have a fridge. It's as simple as that, and it's revealing of how much further we need to go. But I think it's I still want to underline the positive. We got those doses, we got them late, way too late, obviously, but we're working towards something, and this is where I really want to underline this. We've made so much progress too.
So Josephine, there was a lot of criticism towards the WHO at the beginning of the pandemic, because there was this allegation that they were suppressing information, that China actually did a lot of mistakes at the beginning, and is responsible that COVID actually spread so quickly in the entire world. And but since then, the criticism has toned down in the broad media landscape. I mean, of course, you still hear criticism, but it's not so loud anymore. How would you describe, or how would you review the job of the WHO so far during the pandemic? Has it lived up to its expectations?
Yeah, thanks for Aramis for this question. I think it's a really important one. I think, first of all, what is WHO? WHO is, an agency of the United Nations. And I think, the issues that the United Nations are faced with are also faced with by WHO, right? WHO is not independent of governments. And that is such a pain point, obviously, especially when you politicize health. And I think, as you're saying about China, sorry, basically China was stopping WHO from making those inquisitions. China was blocking. So how, this is revealing of like, okay, I mean, WHO basically has its hands tied, like it can only go so far because it cannot go against its members. And its
Donors.
members
Mhm.
are, well, yes, donors also, but it just cannot. And I think that's a real pain point. And I think it's revealing of like the limitations. And actually it's been interesting because right now Indonesia has the presidency of the G20. And I actually stumbled upon an article from them calling for the end of WHO. And you know what? I thought that was revealing. I was like, okay, wow. I mean, WHO has been challenged for a long time. I mean, Ebola was such a mess. I mean, they just messed up so bad. They did not play up to their role at all. And actually, I think 2014, 2015 were especially hard years for WHO. No one believed in them. No one,
Yeah.
I think also one point, the financing of WHO it's nothing. It's $1 billion a year. Just to put us in perspective, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a foundation, private, 2 billion a year. So basically, a private foundation has twice the budget of the international organization responsible for health. I mean, look at
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
it's like, and obviously the problem with having private money going into health is that they do whatever the hell they want. If they want to say we're going to kill reproductive rights because we
could.
don't believe, we can, and I think actually that brings me back to WHO. WHO is not independent from its members. What does this mean? It means that, for example, the US had an agenda where they were not going into reproductive rights for a very long time because of the whole abortion debate, etc. So those programs were killed, and I think this is the issue. We politicize health so much that we obviously WHO can only go so far, and then obviously it doesn't act the way it should, or it's considered that it should. So I think, has the WHO lived up to its expectations? No. Has it failed completely? I wouldn't say either. I just think we need to recognize what the WHO is and what it can do, given its
The
like
resources.
resources, but also the way it's built. It has 193 members, and if the members don't want to go into something, what is it going to do? It's born from governments.
Yeah.
It's not independent.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the same discussion we have regarding the UN, right? Like, how
Exactly.
can you align 199 agendas, and when you have countries that don't think the same, and then even if you do, every declaration from the General Assembly, it's not legally binding. So at the end, the states can do whatever they want. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that the WHO is part of the. No, it's an independent subsidiary organ from the UN, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
among the UN organs, where does it stand? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, it's basically it's like one of the organs of the UN, just like I don't know, for like UNECA in Africa, or
Okay.
like other organizations that depend. And but I think it's going back to, it is not independent. It will never be. It never has. And when you're dealing with something that's insanely political, like a pandemic, because a pandemic is so political, then obviously you're going to be faced with massive issues, such as retention of information. And obviously there's a lot of talk now, and I'm actually part of this WHO, they're creating a global health preparedness network, and I've been invited to participate for the Africa Europe Foundation, and we've had workshops, and they're brainstorming. Okay, how do we share information? How do we share best practices? How do we do it? So the technicians at WHO, they're working so hard. They're trying. They're building networks. They're doing their best. But I think at the end of the day, if at head of state level there's a will to kill some piece of information or kill the spreading, then you can only go so far.
And that's when the whole origin of the pandemic dilemma also appears.
Of course.
How did the pandemic started? Maybe we'll never know.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this discussion, okay, how did the virus originate? And for a long time, a narrative dominated that it was quite clear that it somehow developed not by human hand, but somehow by human nature contact. But and there was always this conspiracy theory that, or something deemed as conspiracy theory, that the virus was created in a lab. And in fact, on social media, you were actually banned for a long time if you claimed that the virus was created in a lab, because it was deemed as a conspiracy theory. Joe Biden, after he took over presidency, took up this topic and actually started an investigation where the US administration researched how the virus originated and whether the lab theory, so the theory that the virus was created in a lab, is true. So Josephine, what do you think? Is it possible that it was created in a lab? Is it even likely?
So actually, Aramis, thanks for this question. To quickly answer your question here, actually, latest evidence points to a wet markets.
Yeah.
So there's been investigations, like latest evidence has been going there, but I kind of want to touch upon the broader topic here, not just COVID-19, but how basically, like also this is very much part of the politicization of health. You're creating all these theories. You're like fomenting unrest. Around this topic. You're creating like you're building dissension between people, like within families, between countries, like at every level. I think that this is very much part of a wider topic of how something that should be hard facts are politicized to manipulate reality and perceptions, and more, like, vaccines, the evidence is sound. Every actual proper study shows that vaccines, like vaccination, is a positive for health and does not create autism, for example. However, there are millions upon millions of people across the world that are so definitively sure that basically maybe Bill Gates is like implanting a microchip
5G.
to control your mind. And I think this is the broader topic of like we're manipulating people. And I think the origins of the COVID crisis are very much in this. It's it's conspiracy all over. And I think this is part of the topic around health, going back into it is intimate, but it's also political. It goes across every level of society,
No, and regarding what you said, Josephine, I want to ask you, Chris, because we've talked about it in university. And do you feel like people should be obliged to get vaccinated, like some European countries are saying? Should it still be your personal choice?
That is the most complicated question I think I will be asked.
Sorry, Chris. I always hit you with the hardest ones, huh?
Yeah, Now I don't have to study for any of my essays. I can just ponder this one for the next kind of months. Really, I don't think it's something that I have any definite answer to. I think it's having as many people vaccinated as possible and having it be as far as it's possible voluntary choice is of course the optimal solution here. But we see the necessity of the vaccines and we see the consequences of not having vaccinated populations. In the discussion of having it mandatory, I don't think I will make any judgment calls on that. But personally, I have a strong inclination as to feeling that people who choose not to vaccinate while not having any underlying disease, having any very specific reason to not vaccinate, not doing it is a disservice to your fellow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fellow war diplomacy listeners, please, if you're not vaccinated, go get your vaccine. Please do
Yes,
so.
it is. It is
Just
very.
do you want to jump in that topic, or is it
I
too
mean,
political?
no, I look, I am transparent. I've always been clear. I work in health, not that I'm a scientist by background, but I work in public health. I think that belonging to a society goes with rights and obligations. And if you want to participate in your society, if you want to enjoy the benefits of your society, socializing, enjoying joining crowds, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. I think that yes, you want to enjoy the benefits of society, then you got to be vaccinated. You don't want to be vaccinated,
That's your
then you
choice,
don't
bud.
enjoy. And I think,
Yeah.
you know what? I
Thank you for
100%
putting it
agree with the
bluntly,
French
Josephine.
approach.
The QR, the
Basically,
Toitas.
it was all about saying, you don't want to get vaccinated, we're not going to force you. But you're not going to go to the cinema. You're not going to go to the bar. You're not going to go to a concert. You can, take care of your kitchen garden in your garden.
And the
Sure.
next day, a million people.
That is the
registered,
optimal
right?
solution.
Yeah, I mean that's really how I see it. It belonging to society comes with rights and obligations, and
Yes.
this is very much part of it. And I understand it is a very intimate topic because it is you injecting a foreign substance into your body. And I mean, I understand this is not nothing. However, I think also one thing is that we're so used to like being vaccinated as children for all these diseases, we've forgotten what it means, like polio, for instance. Does anyone among us know the consequences of polio? No.
No.
This was millions of children that had their lives. They either died or were handicapped for life. Then what we do, we create this vaccine, and all of a sudden we forget about polio.
Yeah.
And so it's so far away from our like collective imagination, the benefits of vaccinations, that all of a sudden all these conspiracy theories can be born. And I think that's part of it. We forget the benefits of vaccines. We need to remind ourselves that
There's one point that people that don't want to get vaccinated say that kind of like hits my mind, and I think they have a point. It's that we still don't know like the long term, like the few long term consequences of this vaccine, right? Because some medicines they take years and years to develop, and those studies to know like the 10-year is it going to be okay or not for you. So I think that's a good point that they have. To be honest, I kind of agree. Like we will never know. How do you guys?
Yeah, but
see
if
that?
you have cancer, are you going to be like, oh, I don't know the long-term consequences of this new chemotherapy? I mean, I think you can have the same argument for every disease. But
And it's also-
are you still not going to do it?
And it's also, I feel, in a sense that we're all doing it. So at least if we're all doomed, then we're doomed together, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the world is gonna end with a global climate crisis anyway, right? So it's like how many years do we have left anyway? No, I'm just kidding. That's a really pessimistic point of view.
Yeah, so back to the topic of the whole lab theory, I think that it's also important to keep in mind that I haven't read the report. I'm not gonna claim to have done so. I do feel that I trust health policy professionals like Josephine who tell me that this most likely have originated in markets is more of a sound theory. And also that we have to keep in mind who are conducting these reports. The U.S. has very big interests in having a reason to discredit China as a whole on the global arena. So I take claims by the U.S. that China forged this virus in the lab with a whole handful of salt, to say the least. But I of course, it's something that I don't know, potentially will ever know for sure. But I will trust the professionals on this one. And Josephine, you've made a sound argument for that. I'm wondering, also as a professional, Josephine, what are your thoughts on what comes after COVID? What are we going to see in the aftermath of this?
I think that one of the positive outcomes from this pandemic has been that I think, global health has been kicked up to like on top of political agendas. And I was mentioning that earlier, but head of state level. And I think, finally, because that wasn't, like obviously the HIV crisis up to a certain extent. And however, yes and no, there was a lot of like, you looked at the US approach to it. It was pretty awful. But I think that there's been unprecedented investments in health. And we're finally looking at not just combating, for example, tuberculosis or malaria, but actually proper strengthening healthcare systems, like proper investing in universal health coverage. And I think that's a positive. Like, for example, the European Commission has just announced 500 million collaboration, investment towards manufacturing for health products in Africa as part of its global gateway package. The European Investment Bank has just invested 500 million in collaboration with WHO to strengthen healthcare systems. And the Biden government has just, put a lot of money on the table as well towards universal health coverage and health system strengthening. And I think that's a positive. And it's gone high up on agendas, and there's action being taken, and there's money being allocated. Finally, finally. Now the challenge is, and this is the reality of, I think every political topic, right? How do you sustain it? How do you keep the momentum? And we're already seeing it in Europe. We're all focused on Ukraine right now, and it's okay. I mean, money has been put on the table for health. It's great. It's there. It's been invested, but it's not just about a one-off investment. We need long-term, full focus and attention. And I think that's the challenge for everyone in health, is how do we keep this momentum? How do we not, have people just forget about it because it's not affecting their lives anymore? So that's the next step. So I think a positive is money's on the table, investments are there, but it's like, for how long, and how do we sustain this?
Aramis, do you have anything to add to this point? How do you see
Yeah.
the pandemic?
Yeah, I think in general it's tough to answer what comes after COVID, because we don't know when COVID will be over. But I think that there is a potential that the pandemic will have much worse consequences for the entire world because of the lack of support for the global South. And while this would be horrible, of course, this catastrophic consequences could build the ground for radical change in global health policy. And maybe this could then in turn be the ground for a sustainable way of how we can at least maximize our control on the future spread of more diseases.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there will be, like we always study history and contemporary politics. Like there's major events, and not just like I freaking know that COVID will be a before and after event. Like we talk about 9/11, like a post after. We will talk about the Ukrainian war as a post after, but the pandemic has had consequences all over the world. That I don't think that like the Second World War was one of those major worldwide events. The next one is the pandemic. I think like that has touched every single point and corner in the world. I don't even think that the 2008 financial crisis impacted every single person in the world as COVID has done. As the Second World War, maybe not even the Second World War touched every single person, but this disease, it did. And there's always going to be a before and afterwards. The good times and the bad times.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I think we're, as you guys are saying, we're still there. We're still in the pandemic, but we're still, I think we don't have to wait for every case to be over before we start, drawing conclusions and reckoning. And, I think on the global, political level, that's happening. For example, the European Parliament just set up a COVID study group, between MEPs to understand, okay, what are the lessons learned? Where do we go from here? What could we have done better? What will we do better? And there's so much money going into pandemic preparedness now. I mean, billions. And there's a tension here because this money, obviously, that was allocated to other diseases is being put towards pandemic preparedness. For example, there was like HIV programs, etc. I mean, money doesn't grow on trees, so you have to reallocate. But I think that definitely that this is a real moment of reckoning. And I maybe one last point for me is saying, this is the perfect example of the necessity for global cooperation. Because if you don't have cooperation, then everyone suffers.
Yeah.
And I think that, rich and poor alike. And this is not ingrained enough but it's a lot more ingrained than it used to be. And that's good, you know? It's just like climate change. Everyone's
Yeah.
going to suffer.
Yeah,
Everyone
yeah,
is
for sure.
suffering, you know? And these are things that you can't move around. You can have billions and hide in your mansion, but you're still going to be affected, you
Yeah.
know, the same way as
Yeah.
everyone else.
Guys, it's tradition here in War Diplomacy. We always recommend at the end of the episode. It could be anything, a series, movie, whatever. So let's start with you, Aramis. Anything in mind?
Yes. So today we talked a lot about how politics is often irrational and like there is in theory a solution that could be put through, but in the end, politics sometimes is not highly efficient. And a series where you can really get an understanding of how that political reality is and get an understanding of why politics is sometimes so irrational and such a bargaining thing. The series Borgen is actually, in my opinion, a good example of how this looks like. And actually, there will be a new season published pretty soon. So yeah, I think that's just a good in general a great series and a great way to kind of get an understanding for that.
Okay, what about you, Chris? Have anything interesting this week?
Yeah, so this ties in a lot with what we've been touching on today, really, and also the closing remarks of Josephine on what comes ahead. Book called Global Health Security: A Blueprint for the Future by Lawrence Gustin, who he's an expert on pandemic preparedness, and writes on a blueprint for the future of new global health security and how we have to strengthen global cooperation and also maximize the distribution of health systems worldwide to create a more prepared system for pandemics, which are of course going to happen again. So we have a lot of lessons that we hopefully have learned from COVID and that we have to take on further to the future.
Josephine, your guest, special guest from this episode. Do you have anything
Special
in
guest.
mind?
You know what? I think it's not about this week. I think maybe one thing I would call for is, you know, health is cool, guys. Health is such an interesting topic. And I'm gonna say call for like whoever is struggling and thinking of like, okay, what do I want to do professionally? Consider global health. You know,
Okay.
because it goes from, you know, dealing with biomedical warfare until sexual and reproductive rights and talking about equity. I mean, health is everything. Health is everywhere because we're basically our health, you know. And I think it's
Yeah.
that's my call, you know, because I remember studying global health at university, and we were so few, you know, because
Mhm.
so few of us saw the interest. And I think this pandemic has been good for this, but I'm going to continue calling for it. It's like consider global health as a career path because
Wow.
you will not be disappointed, you know?
Wow, not gonna lie, I think that's one of the best recommendations we've had.
I
No,
love that, Josephine. I love that.
yeah,
Thank
how
you.
lovely. Mine is gonna sound really cliche. I cannot top the bar after what Josephine just said. I was gonna recommend this movie called Contagion.
It's
You know,
great. I recommend it as well.
it's an interesting film, you know.
Very
and
good movie.
I remember at the beginning of the pandemic,
Mhm.
watching this movie and be like, "Oh my God, it's the end of the world. We're done." I mean, it was not the end of the world. It was a fun movie to watch. And the second recommendation I have it's this really interesting conference that's going to be hosted here in Brussels by the Brussels School of International Studies. It's going to be quite interesting. You can, for all the listeners, you can register and listen it and follow it from your computer, whatever you are. Christine and I were organizing it, and it's quite interesting because our guest here, Josephine, she'll be the moderator of one of the panels. So for any one of you interested in climate change, in the future of global alliances, or in development, we're gonna have this really interesting conference the 7th of April. So we're gonna leave the link and all the information in a highlight in the stories in Instagram. So if you're interested, there you go. Guys, it's been such a wonderful episode. I'm really, really happy. I think it's one of the best we've done so far. And it's a topic that has affected everyone. So I expect a lot of people to listen to it. I don't know,
It
guys, if
was
you have any
great. Thank you
advice.
so much, Josephine.
Fully agree.
Thank you guys, my pleasure. I could talk for days, you know. I think this is my passion. But I'm glad that you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, because I really did. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
All right, guys. So please follow us in social media. We have episodes every now and then. And well, this was Warrior Diplomacy. Awaken your inner warrior.